Good morning, everyone. My name is Courtney Doggart. I'm the president of Network 2020, and it's a pleasure to be here today with Antony Phillipson. Really quickly, before we begin, just for those of you who don't know Network 2020, we're a New York-based nonprofit organization that's focused on creating more informed conversations around foreign affairs and international relations. At one point, I'm about to introduce our speaker. Before I do, you might see a poll pop up, and this is from Brian at Network 2020, and we're just trying to get a better thing. So if you wouldn't mind just taking a moment to fill that out, we would really appreciate it. So now over to Antony, who is the British Consul General in New York and Her Majesty's Trade Commissioner for North America. He was announced to that position in February 2018 and became Her Majesty's Consul General in New York in November of 2017. He has been with the civil service since 1993 and held a number of posts in Her Majesty's government, including Principal Private Secretary to the Secretary of State for Trade and Industry, Counselor at the Embassy in Washington, Prime Minister's Private Secretary for Foreign Affairs, the head of the FCO Iran Coordination Group, High Commissioner to Singapore, and the Director of European and Global Issues Secretariat, the Cabinet Office, and Director of Trade and Partnerships in the Department for Exiting the European Union. He has a master's degree in modern history from the University of Oxford, and I think between all of that education and experience, we are in very good hands today. So I'm very much looking forward to this talk, and I'm going to turn it over to Antony right now. Just for a few minutes, if you could just give us an overview of, just kind of lay of the land of what's happening in terms of UK-US relations, and in particular, some of the trade issues that you're working on.
Great. Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much to Network 2020 for the chance to come and talk to you all. I remember doing a session when we were able to meet in person specifically about Brexit. I enjoyed that immensely, and I'm looking forward to this one as well. So as you say, let me just maybe outline a few thoughts about what we're up to here in the US, focusing primarily on the UK-US piece, but I might also just touch back in on Brexit and the UK-EU angle, because it's still really important to us. A little bit about what we're doing to understand and address the impacts of the COVID crisis, and especially the economic crisis created by the COVID pandemic. And then maybe just a couple of words on sort of how the UK sees the world that we are all living in, because a lot of the big challenges that we're dealing with there, they're integral to the UK-US economic dialogue just at the minute. And after that, I'd be very, very happy to take questions, either more detail on what I've talked about, or if there's something I haven't talked about at all that you were disappointed, I can go back over that as well. So let me start with UK-US. I mean, this is that is the main bit of the day job. I have always described what I think we're trying to do here across the UK network, both across the Department for International Trade networks across the US. I also look after the networks across Canada as well. We might come back to that in a little bit. But also working with our other consuls general in the other major cities in the US, our trade policy colleagues based out of the Embassy in Washington, who I work very closely with. What we call that the Prosperity Network. Our aim is to enhance the UK's prosperity through deepening and strengthening the economic partnership with the US. We start from an incredibly strong base. The US is our single biggest export market. We're the biggest investors in each other's country. I also would argue that we are the biggest source and indeed destination of each other's innovation. And I think, the relationship between the two of us is just so important to creating jobs, growth and prosperity for all parts of the UK and indeed all states in the US. And that's the day job. There are some areas where we're particularly focusing on at the minute, including right at this moment, the free trade agreement negotiations that we launched with the US on the 5th of May. This is something we've been working towards for almost 2 years before we launched. And indeed, we had intended to launch the negotiations probably in around about April 2019, when we were originally planned to have left the EU on the 29th of March 2019. The deadline for that slipped, as people may know, and I'm again happy to talk about why that slipped. But eventually we did leave the EU on the 31st of January, and I think this is something that's worth just really highlighting. We have left the EU. We're still in a rather odd half in, well, actually, some people say it's half in, half out. It's not really, because we're all the way out. as of the 31st of January. We are no longer a member state. And we are in what's called the transition period, during which the engagement between the UK and the EU remains the same, but as I say, we are not a member, and that transition period will end at the end of this year. So the FTA, we launched it on the 5th of May and immediately held the first round. It's not a normal negotiation. It's certainly not a normally conducted negotiation. We're doing it virtually because we can't have people getting together in big delegations of 100 plus negotiators on each side. They conducted negotiations across all around about 30 chapters of the FTA that we're aiming for over the period between the 5th and the 15th of May. Since then, we have been sort of working through where we are, and we are gearing up for the start of the next formal round on the 15th of June. The other reason this is not a normal negotiation is we're trying to do it very, very fast. Even had we launched in April, people were telling us that it was going to be tight to get an FTA done before, for example, the presidential election later this year. And then there's also, some may know, the US has authority from Congress to negotiate trade agreements called Trade Promotion Authority that actually expires in the summer of 2021. So again, we've always been very conscious of those two sort of external contexts affecting this negotiation. I do, though, I really strongly believe that we can do an FTA in the time that we have available. And that's for a couple of reasons. First of all, I think there is very serious political will on both sides. The President of the United States, ever since he entered the Oval Office after his inauguration at the end of January 2017, his first visitor was the then UK Prime Minister Theresa May. And they said then that their ambition was to do a bold, comprehensive FTA between the UK and the US. That is not changed under now Prime Minister Boris Johnson, and we are absolutely committed to doing this as remains the President. The other reason I think we can do it is because we've done an awful lot of prep work. There is something called the Trade and Investment Working Group that has been meeting between primarily USTR and DIT, USTR on the US side, Department of International Trade on the UK side, along with colleagues from across the two governments. That's been meeting since the summer of 2017 and has met 6 times. And while we were not negotiating, we were doing an awful lot of the prep work to get ready for the negotiation that we have now launched. So I genuinely believe we can move very fast. I also think it's important that we do. I would have been saying that even without the COVID crisis or the economic impact of the COVID crisis. Some might argue that an FTA that may only be looking to raise GDP in both countries by, say, 0.2%, well, how's that really going to make a difference compared to the economic, the serious economic context of COVID? But I think I would just observe 2 things. Nothing. Second of all, I think it could generate more economic benefit in the future if we get it right. I also think that we've shown that more exports generally tends to lead to higher quality jobs in each other's community. And I think that's a good thing, especially for small and medium-sized enterprises who are both, particularly hit by the COVID crisis, but also a particular focus of the negotiation that we are conducting. And both the UK and US sides have said that we aim to have a separate SME chapter in the FTA to make sure we get it right for them. So that's what we're doing on the FTA track, and as I say, very happy to take more questions about that. Just on the UK-EU front, because it's related to the UK-EU-US piece, not least because people keep asking us, how can you really do a UK-US agreement before you know some of the answers about where we're going to be between the UK and the EU? Or indeed, do we really have the bandwidth to do both? The second one I think is very easy. Yes, we do. We have separate negotiating teams, separate lead negotiators on both tracks. In terms of the interrelationship, I think there is definitely a dynamic relationship between the two negotiations. But there are some things that we know what the answer will be between the UK and the EU, including, for example, on our tariffs. And we published something called our Global Tariff Schedule a couple of weeks ago. I think it was around about the 8th of May, that sets out what our tariffs will be. So we've set the terms against which we will negotiate future tariff arrangements with the US. There are some other areas maybe around our digital relationship or digital trade relationships between the UK and the US and UK and EU, where we may need to have a bit more detail about where we end up with the EU, but I think we can still sort of pitch forward now as to where we expect to end up and have that discussion with the US so that we can get on with things. So I'm very confident about that. In terms of the UK-EU, just a couple of points of detail. So we The transition period that we're in that I mentioned will end at the end of December. There is continuing debate, as people will see, about whether there will be an extension. The UK government has made clear that it does not intend to request an extension. We believe that will only prolong the uncertainty. We can complete the negotiation with the EU in the time available, and we should do so in order to give business a clear picture about the way forward on that track, alongside the opportunity that we want to create on the US track. Just a couple of words on the global context that I mentioned at the beginning. The UK has moved very quickly to take our independent seat in the World Trade Organization. We continue to see the real importance of working with the US and Canada, for that matter, and other partners in groups like the G7, the G20, the IMF, the OECD, the WTO itself, etc. And the reason I mention all of that is because I think we are going through a moment where there's a lot of flux, really, maybe in the global economy. There are a lot of challenges in the global economy. How do we manage the impact of China in the global economy and some of the issues that are sort of hotly debated at the minute? How do we set the future rules for the global economy around issues like AI and quantum? How do we exploit the opportunities of commercialization in space? And I think the reason I mention that is because I think for the UK, having a discussion with partners and allies at a global level to set the rules and the frameworks and the norms for the future of the global economy is fundamentally important. And that's one of the reasons, actually, again, why we want to get on with the UK-US negotiation, because if in that we can have a discussion about the future of our intellectual property protections, if we can set gold standards for a digital trade relationship between the first and fifth biggest economies in the world, two of the most e-commerce focused economies in the world, then we can take that relationship into those global discussions and set the frameworks that will benefit both of our countries going forward. And then finally, just really coming back to the immediate context that we're in and COVID. So obviously in the first few weeks, couple of months of the pandemic, there was a lot of focus on the resilience of our supply chains, not only in personal protective equipment and PPE, but also food and other essential supplies. I think the fact that in both the UK and the US, we didn't see big food shortages was because our supply chains to some degree held up, but they certainly have been affected. And supply chains in other sectors have been fundamentally disrupted in travel, hospitality, retail, the leisure sectors. And I think that, again, just points to the need to have a conversation between the two of us about our future resilience. The Prime Minister uses a phrase that we need to build back better. We need to come back stronger if we can from this, so that if in the future there is another pandemic or if there's another sort of external economic shock, we will be more resilient than we've proved to be this time, because that's what we need to do to deliver not only prosperity but security for the citizens of both countries. So let me pause there. I've sort of sprinted through some quite big topics there. Very, very happy to take questions on any and all of that, or indeed, as I said, anything else. Thank you very much.
All right. Terrific, Anthony. Thank you so much. That was really a terrific overview of what's happening. And as you were speaking, there were actually a lot of questions coming in the Q&A box already. So I am going to not do what I normally do, which is ask questions from myself right now. But actually, I'm going to turn to the Q&A box, because I think people have learned that that in first come, first served, it always helps to get your question in first. And so we'll start to go through what participants are putting in there. And if you are listening and you would like to ask a question, please feel free to put it in the Q&A box, or if you're calling in, you can email Brian at bthang@network2020.org. So the first questioner wants to know, so they're saying, we are looking to sell food products to Britain, but our food product standards are not as high as the standards in Britain, nor are there plans to invest or improve the quality of our food here. So how do we intend to sell products that you might not want or that might not meet your standards?
So it's a very pertinent question. There's quite a lot of debate about this issue, including in the last few days in the UK press. I mean, those who've been involved in trade issues and in any of the discussions around UK-US trade over the last few years, people tend to get very quickly into some fairly predictable and traditional issues around, are we going to allow in hormone-treated beef or chlorine-washed chicken, etc. My view on this has always been that what we should be doing is exploring the opportunity to increase exports and imports between us. We believe that one of the reasons for doing an FTA is in order to increase consumer choice for UK consumers, and indeed for US consumers, because we also have our own offensive interests in some of the agricultural products in terms of addressing some of the still quite high tariffs on, for example, cheese and dairy products coming into the US. On the issue of standards, again, my way of looking at it would be that we have different standards. We have standards that have been adopted over the years to meet the wishes and in some cases demands of our consumers. But I do think we can have a conversation about whether we can bring those standards closer together. I do think we can have a conversation about, even if there may be certain areas where we still won't be able to sort of line things up, that doesn't mean that there won't be agricultural market access. I think there can be significant agricultural market access, and indeed, if I was really honest, I would say that unless there is agricultural market access, then we would have a problem getting any FTA through the US Congress. Equally, on the flip side, there's a UK Parliament who will also need to have a say on any deal. So I think these are live issues. I think they're more complicated and sophisticated, actually, than sometimes they get portrayed in the press, where, as I say, we tend to focus on two specific products. I think we should keep our ambitions open in terms of how we can, as I say, bring that sort of greater choice, greater range, cheaper prices for UK and US consumers. And that's what I think we should keep our eyes focused on.
All right, thank you. If I might press you on that just a little bit, what do you see an alignment of standards looking like? Is that something that we need to change what we're exporting? Is it something where the UK might relax its standards a little? How do those start to coexist, or the overlapping circles get a little bit greater, so to speak?
So I think two thoughts. I think one is, the need to comply with the standards of a market that you're exporting to. That's not new. That's not unique to the UK and US in agricultural products. I mean, that's actually how most trade agreements work. Secondly, though, I think there is more we can do to have a conversation between us about the future of the standards, not only in our own economies and our own jurisdictions, but globally. I think there is a lot we could be doing to talk, not least because, again, certainly in the UK, in terms of, sort of consumer opinions and attitudes, I think there's a conversation we can have about the future of organic farming. I also think there's a really important conversation that we need to have about the environmental impact of farming and how farming is going to have to adapt actually to changing environments. I mean, that's a sort of two-way street. So I think if we can focus on that, and if we can focus in terms of, what the standards are going to look like in the future, rather than whether either of us has to adopt to the other one, I think there's a richer vein to be tapped there.
All right, thank you very much. So in many ways, build back better, and it can apply across the
grow back better. Yeah.
Grow, right, exactly. So the next question is, Britain has excellent technology and engineering services which can assist with automation and improve process efficiencies. But in the US, we are promoting and maintaining manual processes. I just got that one just lost. Oh, there it is. So what deals can we make, and how quickly can they go into effect given those roadblocks?
So if I understand the question, and if whoever asked it thinks I missed the point, please do find a way of flagging it. I mean, again, I think UK and the US, I think we're not the same economies. I also think, I always personally resist sort of any sense that we are exactly the same and therefore we will act the same. But I do think there are some commonalities to our economies. First of all, I think we both have a commitment to advanced manufacturing. And I think sometimes that gets overly simplified as being all about automation. And then, I think there's a very important conversation to be had about the future of jobs, the future of work, and where jobs are going to be created in the future. And maybe, again, the impact of the COVID crisis brings this into really stark relief. There may be some sectors, some types of economic activity that either never come back or come back, we sort of short circuit through some of the cycles towards automation. But I actually think that it's going to be quite a long time before everything that was done manually and by people is replaced by machines. And I do again think that there is a discussion to be had between the UK and the US in some of the, the impact of technology on some of the traditional sectors, whether it's fintech or we tend to put tech at the everything, edtech, medtech, insurtech, regtech, et cetera, et cetera. But I think we will still have people working in advanced manufacturing. I think, and I think there is, again, some common challenges that the UK and the US can work through together on that. Again, one of the conversations that's certainly going to be driven by COVID is, where are, back to the point about resilience, where are our supply chains and which countries are they in? Do we need to bring those jobs back home? I'm not sure I myself believe that it's, certainly for the UK, credible to have all of our, did I just blank out there quickly? Sorry.
Momentarily, but you're back, so totally fine.
I don't know why, my iPad is plugged in, but for some reason it's not charging. I might...
Are you okay on the battery side?
I'm okay for the minute, but
okay.
I might just, when I get the next question, I might just see if I can get one of my kids to come and plug this thing in somewhere.
Okay.
Anyway, speaking about automation and manual labor. So, I think those are big conversations that we need to have about the future of work, the future of our economies, the future of supply chains. And I think we need to do it in a way that is open and transparent, because I think there are legitimate concerns about the impact of automation on employment. But as I say, I think if the UK and US can't have that conversation together, then we will not be in as good a place as we could be.
All right, terrific. I mean, it sounds like a lot of the conversations that are being had now are foundational for looking ahead. Are you all set on the iPad side?
Yeah,
or would
keep
you...
going with the next. So this sounds ridiculous. Keep going with the question, and I will ask someone to come and plug me in.
Okay. All right. Well, the next question is actually about Canada, and so how important is Canada, or how important will Canada be for the UK in the Brexit era, with the post-Brexit era, I suppose, that we're in?
I think this is a really important question. And as you noted, I cover Canada, and I work very closely with our colleagues in the High Commission in Ottawa and in our other consulates across Canada. Canada, I think, is, again, a really interesting economy for us. Highly sophisticated, highly engaged, not exactly the same. Sorry, I'm going to pause. I'm going to ask my son to plug this in. Can you duck under there, unplug that? For some reason, it's not charging. And then if you plug into that extension cable. Thank you, duck. Thank you. Sorry, this is real live. So Canada, I also think, is another country that, oh, okay, that is charging. No, yes, okay, success, thank you.
Excellent, thank you.
I think Canada faces, again, some of the same challenges as we do in terms of the future of its sort of economic journey. Again, I hesitate before ever calling any country like-minded, because I think it's a bit lazy. But we sit in some of the same groupings, including all the ones I mentioned earlier, but Canada also gets to sit with us in the Commonwealth. So actually, I can think of very few organizations and global fora where we are not sitting alongside Canada, having a similar conversation from a pretty similar degree of impulses. Canada, I think, also is doing some fantastic things in terms of not only its own sort of economic strategy. So we talk a lot about tech and AI, and people tend to get very focused, obviously, still on the west coast and east coast of the US. But some of the activity happening around Toronto on AI, with the cluster of universities, the finances, and the companies, I think is incredibly exciting. And then there are the corridors. You reach down through Toronto to Chicago, or in Toronto and Montreal down through Boston down to New York, Vancouver down the west coast through Seattle and down to California. Trade is global, and I think that I'm not. Again, I don't want to oversimplify, but if we're not having those conversations with Canada as well, then we're going to have a problem. The other thing that Canada is doing that we're very interested in is it has started a small group of WTO member states talking about WTO reform. We fundamentally believe that WTO reform is needed. I think the US certainly has its very clearly stated concerns about some of the activities in the WTO, and we've got a bit of a problem at the minute that because we don't have enough appellate body judges, the dispute settlement appeal mechanism has ground to a halt. So we need to have a conversation about WTO reform, and I think it's fantastically important that Canada has begun that process, and it's something that we are very keen to lean into.
All right, terrific. So the next question is it possible that the UK might seek to join in with the USMCA free trade agreement, or does it simply prefer to avoid all foreign entanglements after Brexit?
Again, I think this is a really interesting one. I'm not sure, again, I'm not sure I would see us joining USMCA. I think USMCA is a particular type of economic construct that is very obviously focused on the interests of the three countries involved. But we have obviously started our ambition to negotiate with the US. We are engaged in a process with Canada of what we call rolling over the UK piece of the EU-Canada agreement, CETA. And the UK has also said that it has an aspiration to join the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, that Canada and Mexico are both parts of. So if we end up in a world where we've done a deal with the US, we've rolled over our agreement with Canada and started to look to the future with them, and we have joined CPTPP, just at the most ambitious, then we will effectively have thickened and strengthened our links with all three members of USMCA. Some might argue, why don't you just join USMCA? But as I say, I think it is an agreement that is particularly focused on those three economies. And I think there are other ways of thickening the links.
Okay, terrific. Thank you. The next question, interesting. It's not quite phrased as a question, but the questioner wants to hear anything that you have to say about GDPR and electronic data sharing and movement. So if you wouldn't mind just talking a little bit about GDPR and where the UK is on electronic data sharing and how that might factor into some of these agreements.
So again, I think it's a really important topic. And I will be honest, I do not claim to be an expert in data agreements. But I would note that, if you go back over the last 5 years, there have been some really important discussions between the EU and US in the context of the Schrems rulings and Safe Harbor and Privacy Shield. I think, obviously, as the questioner notes, we have joined, or the EU member states have taken forward GDPR. That includes the UK, and we have adopted it along with the others. I think where it leaves us is that as we look forward, as I said earlier, to strengthening the links between the UK and the US, we are obviously going to have to get that right in the area of data. Data, I think, is, in some sense, it's the new oil in terms of sort of a fundamentally sort of important sort of commodity within the global economy, and certainly between advanced economies. And we're going to have to work out how we line up the UK's new relationship with the EU and the UK's deepen and strengthen relationship with the US in this area as in others. There are, I think, again, I would just sort of note, I think there are some different perspectives that we take. There's, some people say that GDPR obviously prioritizes data privacy, whereas other jurisdictions are more focused on allowing for the exploitation of data. Again, I think it's too simplistic to say you have to be in one or the other. I think we want to design rules and means of engaging between us that allow for the free flow of data at the same time as addressing very, very legitimate and strongly held views about the use of that data. And I think that conversation will continue to evolve. In the UK, we've done an enormous amount of work to address consumer concerns around online harms. Here in the US, we're seeing a rather immediate debate about Section 230 and whether digital platforms are publishers or just platforms. I think those conversations will continue to develop, and they will continue to be influenced both by policy decisions made by governments, and they'll be continued, I'm sure, to be influenced by legal proceedings and legal cases brought by people who are concerned that somehow we're not quite in the right place. And again, I think I go back to the need for the UK and US as the first and fifth biggest economies in the world, the other way around, we're the fifth, to have the right kind of conversation about the future rules and frameworks in this area in order to enhance the economic engagement between us.
Terrific, thank you. Very, very good to hear. So the next question is, what practical measures are in place or underway to ensure that America First does not negate efforts of initiatives such as the UK Infrastructure Export Program and individual UK companies seeking inroads to USA renewable energy opportunities, particularly offshore wind farm development?
Again, a couple of thoughts spring to mind on that. First of all, I mean, I don't know whether this is what the question was getting at. I mean, at one level, I mean, I've been involved in US trade policy or working with the US on trade policy issues on and off for about 20 years. I don't think, you know, America First in a trade policy objective context, I don't find particularly novel. And indeed, I think actually most countries go into trade negotiations with their country first as their objectives, and that's what our consumers and our companies would expect of us. You know, I'm working on trade policy issues in Washington between 2000 and 2004 was not always easy. We were still in the middle of the banana wars. I remember going up to the Hill early on in my time there to try and lobby for a decision against hitting Harris Tweed as part of a retaliatory measure because of bananas. We were subject to steel tariffs back in 2002. So, you know, not all of the frictions you might look at in the current sort of context are novel. In terms then of some of the issues that the questioner mentions there, I mean, I think again, there's some really important themes to pull out of that. We don't want to only build back better, or well, part of building back better in our view is not only returning to economic growth, it's returning to sustainable economic growth. The UK is hugely committed to getting a grip on the global climate crisis, or beginning to get a grip on the global climate crisis. We will chair the COP26 meeting. It should have been in November this year. It will now be in November next year. And we have committed in legislation to get to net zero, so zero greenhouse gas emissions, net zero greenhouse gas emissions from the UK economy by 2050. And within that, you know, we have placed an enormous premium on renewable sources of energy. Indeed, I think, unless I'm going to get this wrong, I saw the other day that for 2 weeks, the UK economy, or the energy produced in the UK, was fossil-free for 2 weeks in a row. Now, some of that is, unfortunately, I think, the impact of the COVID economic impact, the economic impacts of the COVID crisis. You know, we have shown that you can produce fossil-free energy for an economy the size of the UK's for a period of time, and you know, we need to keep learning from that. Offshore wind is an enormous part of that mix in the UK. We are hugely interested in what's going on here in the US, and we talk to, whether it's the governor of New Jersey, who I was talking to a few weeks ago about this, or I was in Philadelphia just before the crisis hit with the mayor there. He was signing up something called the Powering Past Coal Alliance, which is an initiative that we put together with the Canadian government that now has about 80 signatories, including states, including cities, including companies, all committed to, as it says on the tin, powering past coal. So as we go forward, wrapping all that up, if you look at our negotiating objectives that we published in early March for our negotiation with the US, we highlight the importance of environmentally sustainable economic growth. And we want to use the FTA and other means of discussion with the US, especially at a subnational level, to advance that agenda. So I don't think America First, in that sense, stops us, and I also don't think we should be too scared by the America First attitude of our US trade negotiating partners. Mm-hmm. We probably wouldn't expect anything else.
All right, terrific. Thank you very much. And I think it's also true that some of what's said is also for domestic consumption, and then what happens behind the scenes might be a little bit more of business as usual, hopefully.
It's a negotiation. We all have domestic constituencies. Exactly. All politics is local.
So our next questioner wants to know, what is the balance of imports and exports of the US in the UK? Given that London and New York are the big banking and equity centers of the globe, is it important that London has free access to Europe as it does now?
Again, I think there's a couple of things buried in there. I mean, as I said earlier, the US is the UK's single biggest export market. In any given year, something between 17 and 20% of our exports come to the US. We've actually done quite a lot of analysis, and we can point people to links on this. We've done a lot of analysis looking at the role of exports to the UK and the UK investment here in the US. And we've broken it down by state, and we've broken it down by congressional district. And the reason we did that was because we wanted to tell a story about the importance of the UK economic relationship at a state and congressional district level here in the US. It varies depending on where you are. The states on the East Coast, understandably, have a higher proportion of their exports going to the UK than, say, the states on the West Coast, but it's still not negligible. And the UK investment in those states is really significant. I think the total amount invested between UK and US and US and UK is about $1 trillion, which is no small change. And we have a line that we use in our public remarks that, and I think, again, I may get the numbers slightly wrong, but I think it's around about 1.2 million Americans go to work for British companies every day, and 1.3 million Brits go to work for American companies every day. So I think that's a measure of how integrated we already are. On financial services specifically, I think I would agree that the UK's role as the financial capital of Europe over the last sort of 20, 30 years, maybe going back to the Big Bang in the late 80s, mid to late 80s, I think that has been very, very important. I think it will be different in the future. I don't imagine that we will have the same, exactly the same degree of access to the single market, because I don't think we will sign up to the single market measures that are adjudicated by the European Court of Justice. So I don't think we will have passporting, but I think we aspire to a high degree of access. And I think we also would argue that, again, I think this goes back to my point earlier, that we need to focus on what the economy is going to look like in the future. We need to look at what the opportunities are in the future, rather than focusing all the time just on sort of reconstituting a version of the status quo. I think London will remain a hugely attractive global financial centre. I think the liquidity, the ecosystem that has evolved, the relationship between industry, government and regulators in the UK and in London specifically, that is simply not something you can find anywhere else within the European Union. So it'll be different. It won't be the same as we have now, but I think there will be enormous opportunity. And again, we're seeing this in terms of some of the flows of tech investment. So the tech investment in the UK last year was more than in France and Germany combined. And it's not just London, it's Edinburgh, it's Oxford, it's Cambridge, it's Bristol. The economy is changing. And as I keep coming back to, what I think we have to try and do is find a way of creating rules, frameworks, norms, and relationships between us that enhance those changes, make them future-proof, and keep continuing to create jobs and growth for us all.
Mm-hmm. No, I think it's a really important point that, to keep looking ahead and quote unquote building back better and using this opportunity. It's wonderful to hear you say that. The next question is Silicon Valley important to the UK-US relationship? Unlike the Nordics, Germans, and others, the UK has little to no presence outside of San Francisco, which is 35 miles away from Silicon Valley, in companies such as Apple, Facebook, Google, Cisco, etc. So would you want to respond to what is the UK's relationship with Silicon Valley?
I'm not sure I would accept that we have no relationship or no presence outside San Francisco. I think we have some very good relationships with all those companies. All of them, I think, that you mentioned there are major investors in the UK, and not just in London. We have, and in a sense, a lot of the relationships that we have with them are run through their very, very significant presences in the UK. I think the challenge I would accept is that we need to do more. we need to be more present. I said earlier that I work with our consuls general across the major cities. So we have a consulate in San Francisco, we have a consulate in LA, we have a one-person government officer in Seattle. I mean, that's a pretty big coastline to cover between 3 offices or 2 offices and a person. Actually, now I think about it, we even have someone down in San Diego. So we go full north to south. I think it's a question of how we engage these companies. And then I think it's also about what do we want to engage them about. And this, again, I think I will keep coming back to it. The need to have a dialogue with business, I think, is absolutely fundamental to everything that we do. Our ministers, we all make speeches about creating jobs and growth. But actually, we don't create any jobs and growth. Business creates jobs and growth. So our job is to help business do more business. And that includes the megaliths like Google and Apple and Amazon and Facebook, all the way down to the SMEs who are either being spun out of them or are existing as part of their ecosystem. I guess the other point I would make is that I think it's possible, and again touched on this earlier, it's possible, I think, to get too fixated on Silicon Valley and the West Coast. I think some of the tech investment and developments going on here in New York, some of the growth around other cities like Austin or Nashville, Jacksonville, and then, as I say, the Canada story and how we put all that together. So we need to be more present, but this is a pretty big, 2 continental-sized countries to spread ourselves around. But I completely take the challenge, and we will always need to do more.
Terrific, thank you. So next up is, how has the United Kingdom been successful in keeping its unemployment rate drastically lower than the United States amidst the pandemic? And where did the US go wrong, in your opinion? And what strategic plans does the United Kingdom have in place to assist the United States in reducing its unemployment rate, if any?
So again, I mean, a couple of thoughts, but I wouldn't pretend to be an expert on this. But I think my observation would be that, again, I think this is an illustration of how different we are. Our approach to social welfare and safety nets, I think, is quite different. So in the US, I think there were a lot of people who, the figures showed a lot of people who moved out of work and started claiming unemployment benefits. Whereas in the UK, I think the government focused on working with companies to basically put people onto furlough schemes. And so I don't think, I'm assuming that would explain why there's a sort of radically different sort of reflection in the unemployment rate. I don't think that means that we've done something wrong or right or vice versa. And I don't think it means that somehow we are immune to the economic shock to the economy of the pandemic. And as I say, I think one thing that we are all worried about is that the longer we stay in lockdown, the greater the impact on the economy in this rather sort of harsh but rather illustrative term of scarring on the economy. But obviously, if we come out of lockdown too fast or too early, then there is the very obvious risk of a second wave and then more economic impact. And again, I'm not an economist, but I get the image of whether it's going to be a V or a U or a W-shaped recession. And I think the answer is it's too soon to tell for both economies. And then in terms of how we can help each other, I think that trade and investment between us is going to be a fundamentally important part of our economic recovery. That's why, as I said earlier, I think the FTA, people were disappointed that it's not going to create a bigger economic impact. But actually, I think, A, that's because of the degree of economic integration already. And secondly, I think it can actually strengthen the relationship between the economies, maybe in numbers that don't show up in terms of a GDP benefit. And actually, I think doing this, I was challenged after doing a TV interview after we'd launched, and I was challenged as to why we felt this was the time to do it. Surely, people consumed with COVID or dealing with the COVID crisis and the EU negotiation. I said then, I fundamentally believe it. There's never been a more important time to do this. And I think actually it's really important that we're showing that we can launch these negotiations despite the constraints of not being able to meet physically. And the sooner we can do an agreement that starts to deliver benefit to the two economies, however small that might be, the better. And then I think my other point would be that the FTA isn't the only means of engagement between us. We should keep looking for where we want to work in the other groups I've mentioned, or indeed even bilaterally. Prime Minister and the President in August last year launched something called the Special Relationship Economic Working Group that is designed to look at some of the emerging tech issues or other non-FTA type discussions that we need to have between us in some of the areas like AI, space, quantum, that don't really fit very easily in an FTA. And final thought on that is I think we should just be looking for economic opportunity wherever we can find it, and then really challenging ourselves to put together the necessary discussions between us to drive it forward.
Terrific, thank you. All right. Will the loss of the European Medicines Agency and the European Banking Authority, Amsterdam and Paris, really result in any material downside to the UK?
I think again, I don't think it's a linear, that makes sense, a linear question, because I think, they have left the UK because we have left the single market. There may have been some who thought that we could continue to host both agencies even though we weren't in the single market, but I think there's a certain logic to the very quick conclusion that that wasn't going to make sense. And so I think the challenge for us is to not only reach the agreement we want between the UK and the EU in the areas of medicines and pharmaceuticals, but also in the areas of financial services, as we've touched on. But also to think, okay, so what opportunity does that give us outside the single market to enhance our offer as a global location for the types of discussions and activities that were happening in both of those agencies. Because again, going back to something I think I've said, I mean, there's two ways we can look at it. We can either sort of regret and resent what we've lost, but it's gone. So I would rather look forward, and I'd rather think about, okay, how does the UK continue to offer itself as one of the great global financial centres I've touched on, but also in the areas of life sciences, the next phase of pharmaceutical development, biologics, and things like that. How are we going to set up the right mix of investment in R&D and in skills and academia? How are we going to set up a light touch, progressive, but consumer confidence inspiring regulatory system? And how are we going to market the UK to the world? We have this phrase that ministers use called global Britain, which sometimes people sort of say, well, that's a bit facile. What does it mean? I think what it means is that the UK remains open for business, but that the UK is going to be conducting its engagement with the global economy in a way that is fundamentally different to what we've done over the last 43 years. And yes, there may be some things that particular companies in specific sectors feel they would rather have had in terms of what we had before. But as I say, we've gone. We have left the EU. There is no turning back on that. And so it's now actually, it's not about economic opportunity in my view. And again, COVID, I think, exacerbates this. It's about the imperative of getting out there and putting together these discussions and creating an innovative ecosystem that companies want to keep investing in the UK, whether in financial services or life sciences, or indeed advanced manufacturing, et cetera, et cetera. And that's the challenge.
I so enjoy talking to you because so many conversations I have are doom and gloom, but with you, I'm getting very much a sense of looking forward in a positive way. So it's very encouraging. So the next question, it's a tech question. So the EU has made clear that with Gaia X, they want to create alternative EU platforms to US-based cloud service providers like AWS and Azure. Is this potentially anti-competitive? And I feel bad asking this question because I am not even sure about some of what I just put forward. So I'm hoping you're on more firm ground than I am.
I think I'm probably closer to your position than the questioners.
But we can expand to tech in general and
yeah. I mean, the thought it prompts in my mind, I mean, it sort of a little bit goes back to the question about GDPR. I think the UK has always believed, even when we were within the EU, that the important thing is to create, I keep coming back to the point really, so clear frameworks and norms so that it is, we can regulate. I've always believed that governments have a duty to regulate. They have a duty to protect consumers. But at the same time, we want to get the balance right between that and setting clear frameworks that give a real a clear sense to business of what the investment opportunity is or the investment offer. And so we go through we go through cycles of governments come in and they talk about deregulation. And everyone gets very excited because I think that means there'll be no regulation, it'll be a free-for-all. But actually, I don't think, certainly for the UK, it's never really going to be where we're going to end up. Because I think we have seen too many episodes in our economic history where if you don't have the right, either over-regulation or not enough regulation, it can lead to some pretty serious consequences. And then if we overlay that with, I think, probably the intent of the question, which is, does it matter that there isn't a European Google? Should we have invested in, did we miss a trick 20 years ago? Again, maybe back to my slightly willful optimism. Maybe so, but that was 20 years ago. So I don't believe in building walls within the global economy, which is also why actually my own view, we haven't really talked about it very much, but on the question of how we handle some of the challenges with China, I personally don't believe that the answer is to decouple China from the global economy. A, I don't think it's possible, and B, I don't think it makes sense. But we certainly need to set rules and procedures that all countries and countries for that matter in the global economy need to comply with. So I think we should watch for what either overt or unovert protectionism. I don't think it makes sense to set up sort of national champions, whether in terms of cloud technology or indeed other aspects of the key sectors of our economy. I think we should be looking for collaboration. I think we should be looking to reduce barriers to trade and investment, open up sources of data and technology, give people access to those sources of data and technology, and just keep focusing on creating economic opportunity. I don't know if that addresses the question really.
Well, I hope it does, but thank you for expanding it out for everyone. I appreciate it. The next question is, the questioner lives in Colombia, and they are aware that one thing is so direct exports to Colombia from the UK, but there is also triangulation, meaning that sales to South America are often delegated to US units in subsidiaries, and vice versa. US companies may have become accustomed to basing themselves in the UK for sales into Europe. So mutual trade, in fact, covers a bigger world. So there isn't really a question here, but maybe you might want to, would you mind just talking a little bit about some of the impacts of subsidiary companies, and if you're trading beyond the borders in which you're just looking at. So if you're the US and you're based in the UK and exporting out to Europe, or vice versa, if you're in the UK company and you're have subsidiaries in the US that export to Latin America, South America. How does that look?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, the risk of sort of continuing to sort of bring it back to my own sort of inner monologue. I think it's a reflection of the fact that the global economy is complicated. It's not about hubs and spokes, and it's not about sort of single bilateral relationships. And and again, maybe this will change as a result of building back better and differently and greener and all the rest. But supply chains are incredibly complicated. They grow up for all kinds of reasons, including economic opportunity, including wanting to be close to consumers. I mean, this is one reason, for example, in my view, I don't think it's credible or sensible to try and cut China off from the global economy, because that's cutting, 1.6 billion consumers out of the opportunity for our companies. And I don't think it can only be about opportunity, but you can't ignore that. I also think that, again, just maybe echoes back to the question about USMCA, there is a risk of having a profusion of bilateral trade relationships that end up with incredibly complicated sort of accumulated rules or rules of origin issues. Does this particular widget in this product, what does it have to do to qualify as a US product before it can be sent on to Mexico through the USMCA, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it would be a more straightforward world if you could just have a single rule book, which is why we believe in the WTO. We believe in bilateral engagement. Plurilateral gives you a bit more, so CPTPP or USMCA, or indeed even the EU, I guess, is still by far and away the most sophisticated plurilateral economic engagement in the world. In an ideal world, as I say, you do it all at the WTO level, and then everyone is on the same page and the same rule book. But I think there's a question between whether we just hope that that's what might happen and wait for it, which I don't think it will happen, or we get on with the world that we live in, and we look to simplify where we can. I mean, one reason, actually, so I probably haven't said this bit yet in this context. So I'm one of 9 trade commissioners around the world. I have a colleague who covers Latin America and the Caribbean, and actually for our purposes, she also covers Mexico. And she's based out of Sao Paulo, but we talk a lot about the opportunity for our teams to work together to reach to British companies who are making their way to, say, the southern states of the United States, in order to say, would you like to know more about what's happening in Mexico? Because if you've got here and you're now partnering with US companies who are trading into Mexico, maybe you can go with them or go down to a colleague in Colombia. So I think, again, it's about understanding, especially understanding from business, the patterns of trade that you are experiencing, and therefore where we would have the biggest value add. Because again, maybe joining up a couple of questions here, if I have, this is going to be grossly oversimplifying, if I had 2 more people I could deploy somewhere, does it make sense to put them in Palo Alto in order to address that concern that we aren't present enough outside San Francisco? Or should I put them in Houston with a specific focus on trading on down to the south? Or should I go and put them in Ecuador? Because actually, why don't we put people at the other end of the conversation? And we can only answer that, sorry, this has become a bit therapeutic now. We can only answer that if we understand from business about where the biggest opportunity is and what it is that certainly British companies want to see from the British government.
All right. So if you're listening and if you have any insight, please do send it along on the business side. We're just about to bump up against time, but so I'd like to just ask one more question from the queue. And it's something that you've touched on a little bit, Antony, and it's, can you elaborate on what measures are likely to emerge in the FTA to support the interests of SMEs, small, medium enterprises on both sides?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really pleased to get the question because, as I said earlier, I think it's, we see making sure that this meets the interests of SMEs as fundamentally important. And I think there's a few areas. I mean, some of them are traditional FTA type topics. So I think if you're an SME, you are probably more heavily affected by residual tariff rates in particular sectors. You know, we tend to refer to tariffs below 5% as sort of nuisance tariffs, but if you're an SME, that 3-4% change of the input cost of a product or the import cost of a product can make a really big difference. I think there's also something we can do around reducing bureaucratic burdens in terms of customs procedures, in terms of understanding some of the regulatory requirements that, again, are a bigger burden on an SME than they would be on some of the bigger companies. I also think that we can do more, and this is actually a big focus of our networks already across a lot of countries, do more to highlight opportunities to our SMEs who otherwise might not be aware that there is the chance to join a trade mission to Houston, either to talk about what's going on in the Texas Medical Center or indeed to talk about what's happening in Mexico. You know, I think it is just a sense that for an SME, you have less resource, you have maybe less capability to go and find the offers, the opportunities for yourself, and you are more heavily influenced and impacted by the costs of doing trade. And if we can help reduce those, then I think that's what we're aiming to do.
All right, terrific. Well, I think that is a good place to stop. Thank you so much for taking the time today, and thank you to everyone who participated and asked questions. I apologize that we couldn't get to everyone. You know, perhaps what we can do is just take a compilation of some of the questions and send your way so that you know what's on people's minds, and you know, and maybe there's even an opportunity to answer some of them by email if we're lucky. So just to recap, again, thank you so much. For those of you who are listening, our next briefing is on June 15th, and it's on the challenges to elections under COVID-19. So please tune in. It's a week from now, same time, 11 to 12 Eastern time. And then we're constantly putting new ones up on our website. We'll have a talk about panel discussion on Latin America, and then a discussion about China's diplomacy. So we're adding new ones almost every day. So not every day, but fairly regularly. So with that, I'm sure you are on to your next call. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it from everyone who participated, and I wish you luck in all the work that you're doing, and in working on the U.S.-U.K. relationship. So thank you very, very much. Really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed it. Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.